Mr. Matthew Breiser, thank you very much for taking your valuable time and to give an interview to Ed News. And as you know, we are just tuned to 20 January, going to remember that day. And just because of this, we are now here to talk about the story, a little bit, rewind the story back. Although 32 years have passed since the events of January 20, every year we still celebrate this bloody memory of Azerbaijan. And you are obviously a diplomat who has worked in Azerbaijan and have extensive knowledge about the country's political life. So the question is, what was the reason for these events? In general, could such events not have taken place in the collapsing Soviet countries, including Azerbaijan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the deep pain that so many families in Azerbaijan suffered. And still to this day, I express my condolences to them. And many people I know in Azerbaijan are still dealing with that trauma. And so, in the United States and in Europe, people sometimes like to say that the collapse of the Soviet Union was largely without bloodshed, but that's not true. I mean, this was an empire that was disintegrating. And the power in the center in Moscow didn't want to lose power in crude terms. And so it's more complicated than that, however, because as we know, the Soviet Union was as an empire and sort of as a follow-on of the Russian Empire, had gained control of non-Russian peoples from the Baltic to the Pacific. And so, of course, Azerbaijan and Armenia, there's Soviet socialist republics, were among those. So the first thing I would like to underscore is, anytime you're in the process of an empire disintegrating or decolonialization, tensions emerge between the center and the subjects. That's the first point. And those tensions can be unpredictable. The second point is for years, for decades, even a couple centuries, right? I mean, Azerbaijanis and Armenians lived side by side, literally as neighbors, whether it was in the Yerevan guberniat or Khanate even.
Khanate, yes, governorate. Yep.
Yeah, governorate, Khanate, whatever you want to call it, or in Baku, or in what is today Armenia. I know many Azerbaijanis who were displaced from their homes in what is today Armenia. Yep. But then in 1988, a small group of people in the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic decided to advocate for Armenia's autonomy and even independence or separation from the Soviet Union, but also, of course, for Karabakh itself to be taken outside of the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic. And so that then, when that started happening, and I think it was being engineered by nationalists who had their own agenda, of course, who wanted to distinguish themselves from other Armenians and make careers for themselves, make a name for themselves as being leaders. Well, that inevitably prompted a backlash by ethnic Azerbaijanis who, thought, why should Karabakh no longer be part of the Azerbaijan SSSR? And so, that was 88 when they first started talking like this, as we know. And then, in 1990, there was a declaration of independence, right, of Karabakh from the Azerbaijan Soviet Socialist Republic. And I think that unleashed a lot of emotion among Azerbaijanis. And there started to be fighting and clashes and deaths of Armenians. And then we had the Popular Front then, who saw opportunities, whether it was in Astara or Lenkaran, and then beyond in the Azerbaijan SSR, and looked like they were going to try to grab power from the Soviet authorities, right, in Baku. And so in the end, then Secretary General Gorbachev issued a state of emergency, decided to send in the troops to restore order, much like just happened with the CSTO and President Tokayev in Kazakhstan. And as often happens, the security forces were out of control, and they committed crimes by shooting into civilians. Even if the civilians had been turned violent, as happened in Almaty, it's still no excuse to fire indiscriminately on a crowd. And in the case of Baku, I mean, I don't see evidence of people stimulating violence. They were emotional, they were protesting, But as Gorbachev himself said, as he himself said in 1995, I think it was, the biggest mistake he made was declaring the state of emergency in Azerbaijan and sending in the troops to Baku. It was wrong. And the last point I'll say is, then Defense Minister Yazov, who ended up being a coup plotter of his own, he famously said then, when the troops were being sent in during the state of emergency, that this is necessary to quash a coup attempt. So it was brutal and the wrong thing to do. And I think it's clear that by taking this violent path, Gorbachev stimulated the independence movement in Azerbaijan, because we saw the next year in '91, Azerbaijan declared its independence. So,
That's clear, yeah, of course. The next question, slightly about those who have been in the crime, actually. And as you know, every crime has an account in the world. So no one can escape from this. Everyone should answer at the court. And the events of January 20 is a crime in the history of impunity, to be honest. And of course, it's impossible right now to resurrect the collapsed Soviet Union and bring it back to the criminal court and indict them that what they have done so far. However, some political elements involved in this crime are still hiding in secret shelters in Moscow, within Moscow, or even in the West. Can Azerbaijan bring them to justice with the help of international courts someday or right now?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, because I don't know whether or not statutes of limitation apply. I don't think they do to war crimes. That's really a question for the Azerbaijani government, and does it want to pursue those people? But what I do know is that there have been cases brought already, right? I mean, there's one legal proceeding from way back when, like in 1994, against the actual perpetrators. And there was even a case against Gorbachev himself that was launched in 2003. So those cases are out there. Why they haven't been brought to a conclusion, I simply don't know. But of course, it's possible, in theory, to pursue any war criminals and take them to court. It's a lengthy process, as we saw with the former Yugoslavia tribunal. And it requires a huge amount of evidence gathering. And I just don't know the extent to which people in Azerbaijan have gathered that sort of information. But it's something for historians and then human rights activists, I think, and common Azerbaijanis to be interested in. Yes, because as you say, justice needs to be done, and firing into a crowd of unarmed civilians, no matter how much you worry that there could be people
honestly,
who change the government, is not justified.
Honestly, the experience of the World War II has been done before. Those who have been in the crime of the Holocaust and other crimes, they are still being investigated, and the crime is not dead. It's not covered. So even though it's 32 years since the time that has passed so far, but it's still, there are people that they are still hiding it. That's what I mean. But as we are talking about the crime right now, I just want to ask another question. Is it possible to blame only the former Soviet Moscow for the events that took place during the collapse of the Soviet government? Or do you think that there are still hands of some other Western figures in the crime?
Like, what do you mean by the hands of Western figures? What do you mean, that somebody stimulated the January 20th attacks?
The Soviet regime actually collapsed not by itself. Also, there were hands of other Western figures that Gorbachev was in hands with before. And when Soviet
I totally disagree. I couldn't disagree more. That is completely wrong. That's a false conspiracy theory that is written by people who don't understand at all.
Some people say Gorbachev, they had a secret talks with the former president of the United States before the collapse of the Soviet regime, and that the rumor was spinning around everywhere. So after that, in many countries, in the many post-Soviet countries that took place, to be honest, and Azerbaijan was one of these post-Soviet countries. And the crimes that took place in Azerbaijan was also just leading to the Armenian side, because Azerbaijan was a little bit more conflicted area, as the Karabakh issues and other territorial issues were still ongoing in Azerbaijan. So that's the reason the crime took place here.
Well, for certain, As I said in my first response, the response on January 20th by the Soviet authorities was part of a greater context of Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. And by the way, thank goodness, that conflict is largely finished now with Azerbaijan's victory in the 44-day war, and frankly, with Nikol Pashinyan's victory last June in parliamentary elections. He's now, by the way, becoming more of an authoritarian leader. He's removed the mayor of Yerevan, who was starting to sound independent, even though he had been an ally of Pashinyan. Pashinyan's putting pressure on opposition journalists. But he defeated, the old regime, the Karabakh clan, who were trying to keep the war going against Azerbaijan and didn't want there to be a peace settlement. So he's now in control. And since then, we've seen him, Pashinyan, trying to work toward, a definition of Azerbaijan and Armenia's international border, and then move on to peace talks, and also the regional cooperation projects that are talked about or are agreed in the last January, I guess it was 11th, 2020, trilateral agreement among Pashinyan, Aliyev, and Putin. So yeah, there's that context of Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. But I go back to what I was saying. I was in the middle of saying that anyone who thinks there's a conspiracy that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union or the events in Baku is simply sad. They need to understand the Soviet Union failed. It failed because it was rotten. It was corrupt. It was inefficient. And as Mikhail Gorbachev himself told me when I was able to ask him in 1996 while I was serving in Moscow, the Soviet Union should have collapsed decades earlier. But in 1974, when the oil price crash or increase happened, the Soviet Union got a couple more decades of life because there was so much more money in the system from oil revenues. The system was broken and it was not fit for the modern world. It was fit for the immediate post-World War II period where individual freedoms didn't matter. You didn't need innovation in the Soviet Union, like in the US and Silicon Valley where so many new technologies come. No, you needed to force people and marshal resources to do pretty simple things like build a lot of housing and roads and recover from World War II. In the modern technological era, the Soviet Union could not compete. So that's why it went away. But you need to understand why I react so emotionally is you need to understand what US policy was and NATO policy. The United States did not favor the collapse of the Soviet Union. President George H.W. Bush at the time was worried that if the Soviet Union collapsed, there would be chaos, just like January 20th. There was great worry in Washington that there were going to be interethnic clashes and huge instability, and that the nuclear weapons in Russia and Kazakhstan and Belarus would fall into the hand, and Ukraine could, not in Belarus, but in Ukraine, Belarus and Ukraine could fall into the hands of, who knows, of terrorists or of rogue political military movements. So George H.W. Bush goes down in history for making a speech that people who like to call themselves freedom fighters ridicule to this day. It's called his Chicken Kiev speech. Chicken Kiev is a dish, right? It's a chicken cutlet, with butter in the middle. Yeah. So, but in American English, to be chicken means to be a coward. So it's the Chicken Kiev speech because he gave the speech in Kiev, and he was saying, we're really worried about what might happen if the Soviet Union falls apart. So to say there was an outside hand in stimulating the downfall of the Soviet Union is to completely misunderstand how worried the United States was about his collapse. Of course, Gorbachev talked to the US president. That was his job. And he should have talked to the US president all the time, beginning with Ronald Reagan. They had, they really began to melt the ice of the Cold War, but also with George H.W. Bush. Gorbachev was very highly respected. And when he then faced his own coup in August of 2001, nobody in Washington wanted that. It was a crisis. I mean, I was in Washington through all that, and nobody wanted to see the collapse and the follow-on coup. We wanted a stable Soviet Union, of course, with its citizens or subjects gaining more and more individual rights and more prosperity.
It's quite reasonable, of course. Any political unrest is affecting other countries, of course. And I don't think, I totally agree with you that the United States wouldn't have hand, of course, why they need it to happen and other countries to affect their life and affect inside political life of other countries. Well, as we have been talking about the crimes, and still we are just proceeding this topic. We don't want to digress too much from this, but I want to turn back to the Kremlin, to the Russian, to focus on Russian a little bit. So we every time blame Armenia in every crime. We claim that it's Armenia which is committing this crime every time, particularly in Azerbaijan. However, we know that it's Kremlin's traditional policy, and that they always stand behind every crime that is committed, especially in the South Caucasus. Is it possible to imagine states in the South Caucasus someday coexisting in peace and stability without Russian intervention? And is it possible once to realize it? And also, I'm just concerned about Azerbaijan's life, and especially the peacekeeping groups that are still in Karabakh now, though Azerbaijan has liberated the Karabakh regions, and there are still Russian power, Russian influence. And my question is about that can we imagine the countries, including Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, the South Caucasus countries, coexist together without the intervention of Russia?
Well, it depends on what you mean by intervention. I mean, Russia is an enormous country. You're condemned by geography to be its neighbor. And it's always going to be, the biggest economic player in Azerbaijan's or Georgia's or Armenia's lives, just because of the neighborhood. And it's always going to seek influence, whether it be just to make money, in business, or because of Russia's, as far as we can see into the future, at least, post-imperial, shall we say, sense of history, a sense of empire lost, and wanting to be respected, and wanting to have influence for the sake of influence. That to me is very much a deep part, or a major part of Russian foreign policy, as is, however, wanting a buffer zone of countries that can shield Russia from Europe, from the West, and from the South. I mean, going back to Ivan the Terrible, of course, he was worried about Muslims in the South, to be crude. And so I think we, as far as we can see into the future, there will never be a point where Russia does not seek influence. And by the way, under President Putin, what he really wants is to make sure not only that no South Caucasus countries or Ukraine become members of NATO or the European Union, that's for sure. He doesn't want any such membership, but he also doesn't want successful democracies along Russia's periphery, because that then provides a counterexample to his way of governing, which is obviously not democratic, and it's so deeply corrupt. It's all about a small elite getting unbelievably rich on the backs of the rest of the citizens of Russia. So Russia doesn't want to see very successful countries on its periphery, so that's something to worry about. But Russia does not want war on its periphery either. And so I have to say, as a Minsk Group co-chair, also as a senior foreign official or U.S. official with regard to the South Caucasus, Central Asia, Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, as much as we completely disagreed with Moscow when it came to Georgia or Ukraine today, we agreed on Nagorno-Karabakh. We worked together so well. My Minsk Group co-chair, Ambassador Yuri Merzlikov, and I, but also with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and even President Medvedev, in our Minsk Group deliberations, in which they participated, Lavrov in particular, they were collaborative, creative, and really committed to helping all of us, especially the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia, come up with a framework ultimately for a peace treaty that would provide for a lasting peace. So Russia doesn't want wars on its periphery, but it doesn't want the deep stability either that comes from populations that are prosperous, free, and have all their rights respected. So in that sense, you're going to have to deal with Russia for a long time. However, having said that, right now, for the first time in its history ever, going back to the days of the Khanates, Azerbaijan as a nation has the best chance it ever has had to determine its own destiny. Yes, Russia will be a part of it. Yes, Russian peacekeepers are on the ground, but those peacekeepers are playing an important role, I have to say, as difficult as it is for me to say that as well, because were they not there, we would have seen those Armenian, shadowy forces more and more coming into Azerbaijan and creating violence and trying to, even restart the war. So the Russian peacekeepers have done a good job in keeping the peace. Estonians, where I used to run a think tank, like to joke that Russian peacekeepers take a piece of the country here, a piece of the country there. So peace, P-I-E-C-E, rather than P-E-A-C-E. In Azerbaijan so far, though, they've been keeping the peace, the mir, the P-E-A-C-E.
Yeah,
so the big question is, what happens in 5 years when their mandate runs out? Do they leave, which means they won't be trying to control Azerbaijani territory, but Azerbaijan and Armenia are on their own again, and there could be violence again? Or do they stay against the will of Azerbaijan and then try to create some sort of protectorate of Russia in Azerbaijan? That's the big question that we all need to be thinking about. And my last point is, it's therefore really important that Turkey has a peacekeeping presence in Azerbaijan, because those Turkish troops are NATO troops. And those are NATO's eyes and ears on the ground watching what the Russians are doing.
That's true. Absolutely. I totally agree with this idea. It's last but not least, the final question I want to come up to here. We know this is life and it's full of ups and downs. And Azerbaijan also had many tragic histories before and after 20 January events, such as Khojaly genocide, which is coming up next. And however, in the end, Azerbaijan signed a big victory by liberating part of its occupied territories. You know it. As a diplomat who served in Azerbaijan as well, as we mentioned before, how would you assess Azerbaijan's struggle in Karabakh War, both militarily and politically?
Well, for sure, without doubt, it's the victory in the second Nagorno-Karabakh War is the greatest military and political victory in Azerbaijan's history. No question about it. Militarily, it was a brilliant campaign. Of course, the majority of the credit goes to the extreme courage of the Azerbaijani soldiers, especially that final push to Shusha with the commando attacks and surprising the Armenian forces. And once Shusha was captured, that was effectively the end of the military phase of the war. And I'll come back to that in a second. The second aspect that was so impressive was the speed and the success and the precision of the Azerbaijani attacks that combined, relied on Turkey's innovative technologies, the drone technologies, and tactics. The innovative tactics were to combine the intelligence gathering of drones with artillery, with heavy artillery strikes, as well as with deception using old agricultural pilotless planes to attract the Armenian they were Russian anti-aircraft systems that then allowed the drones to come in and attack and or gather intelligence and allow Azerbaijani artillery to destroy these really quite advanced Russian systems. That was one aspect of innovative tactics. The other aspect was the Azerbaijani military, I think it learned a lot from how Pakistani forces fight in mountains, as well as how US forces fight in the mountains of Afghanistan. And so they were able in the beginning to avoid battles in the streets of towns and cities, like in Hadrut, for example, where the Azerbaijani forces bypassed Hadrut, occupied the high positions above the town, and without fighting, compelled the Armenian forces to leave. And so with minimal losses, Azerbaijan was able to gain that difficult territory in the east. And then there was that Sunday, a couple of weeks into the war, where they broke through the lines and had that extremely rapid advance along the border with Iran. It was breathtaking how quickly, how far they were moving. I was monitoring it with friends of mine in the analytical community in Washington, and nobody could believe how fast the Azerbaijani forces moved. Yeah. And then, as I said, eventually, after some horrible fighting, made it up to Shusha. So that's the kind
of enthusiasm inside the soldiers, to be honest. Over the years, they've been waiting to enter inside Karabakh to see that.
Yeah, and that's why I say the credit goes to their courage or their spirit, their esprit de corps. Yeah, right. But that's the military phase. So then we get to the political side. And I think President Aliyev showed amazing statesmanship and strategic wisdom when he stopped the military campaign in Shusha. I know that many Azerbaijanis were disappointed. They wanted to continue the military operations all the way to Khankendi and beyond and quote unquote clean out all of Karabakh territory. My thoughts then and now are that would have been unwise. Once Shusha was captured, that was the end of the war. It was impossible for Armenia to counterattack. Its forces were destroyed, and the most important spot on the map, Shusha, was now regained by Azerbaijan. It was impossible for Armenia to recapture it, but more importantly, Shusha is of such tremendous symbolic and cultural importance, as every Azerbaijani knows. But on top of that, from Shusha, Azerbaijan controlled all the entrance and egress from Khankendi. And so by not continuing an unnecessary round of military operations, President Aliyev saved many lives, hundreds or thousands of lives, not only of soldiers, but of civilians as well. He also made it possible for Armenians to remain in their homes in those areas of Karabakh where they stayed, because the goal here is that there will be Azerbaijanis returning to their homes, Armenians will live side by side, and the two countries will begin to heal by virtue of living together again. And then the third thing that was so important from stopping in Shusha and then allowing for humanitarian assistance to be delivered to the Armenians, or allowing the Armenian population that had occupied Kelbejar 10 more days as they requested before leaving, or providing natural gas when there was maintenance on the pipeline supplying the Armenians in Karabakh, providing Azerbaijani natural gas, I mean. In that case, Azerbaijan showed the world what it means to conduct and end a war in a humane way. And that has gained Azerbaijan a lot of recognition. It deserves more recognition, but it needs the support that will come from that recognition from the international community to attract the investment now that's going to be needed to rebuild all those regained lands. So tremendous victory, both militarily and politically, by Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much for generous information. Thank you for taking your time again to join us, and appreciate. Thank you so much.